Professor Bardley had flipped through almost all of the books about ghosts that he could find. Some of them were more helpful than others. The biography of that Drake fellow was actually surprisingly informative, but most of them were far less helpful than he would have liked. He sighed as he placed the books back on the shelf, one by one. If he was going to find out more information about ghosts, he was going to have to do his own research. Surely there were enough ghosts in Ifam Cove for him to get some useful information. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the lights turned on. Professor Bardsley was surprised, glancing at his watch, which turned out to be a fruitless effort, as the watch was frozen at the time of his death. How inconvenient. He frowned, then glanced around the room until he spotted the clock. Good heavens, was it morning already? It was so much easier to lose track of time as a ghost. Not interested in a confrontation with Mrs. Potter, Professor Bardsley immediately vanished, not even bothering to put away the final book he'd been reading. Whoever walked into the room next would likely wonder why someone had left an elaborately detailed account on the downfall of WaffleNet Village on the table, but he didn't care about that right now. He left the library, uncertain of what to do next. He drifted aimlessly through the town for a while, wondering where all the ghosts were hiding, when he noticed it. A body, lying on the corner of Fulton and Main Street. He moved closer to get a better look, surprised to find that it was the body of that young man who had assaulted him over his hair just yesterday. He couldn't help but smirk to himself over the cruel irony, realizing it was likely the doing of his fellow mafiosos. He checked for the Chill of the Night's signature paper snowflakes, and he quickly found one, but it was somewhat different than he had expected. It was combined with an ace. Abominable Ifam. We've formed an alliance? Professor Bardsley thought, not certain what to make of this new information. They'd killed one of Abominable Ifam, hadn't they? How could they form an alliance after blood had already been shed? It didn't matter to him, especially not now, but he still found it rather puzzling. He wouldn't have expected Abominable Ifam to be so quick to forgive. His train of thought was interrupted when he heard voices. He quickly moved away from the body, hiding behind the Siren Song Steakhouse. The two girls who approached were workers at the movie house, which he could quickly deduce from their conversation. Apparently some generous individual had paid for tickets for everyone in the town to watch a movie. This was unusual, but also very intriguing. Professor Bardsley couldn't help but wonder how many people would take up the offer. Maybe even some ghosts would attend as well. Perhaps he would have to stop by the theater himself. He stayed to watch the morgue workers take away the body, as well as the various reactions to the death, which he always found so fascinating, before following the others to the movie theater. While he didn't particularly care for the movie, he was curious to see how this played out. Cassidy didn't feel particularly motivated to go to class that day. What with all the murders, plus her anthropology teacher being dead, well, grades didn't really feel all that important right now. There were more important things to worry about, and she had to get to the bottom of all of it. When she heard about the free movie showing, she was curious. On the one hand, it seemed a little too convenient. This wasn't some kind of trick by the Mafia to have them all killed off, was it? At the same time, if everyone was going to be there, perhaps it would be the best chance she had to actually do some proper investigation. So, perhaps against her better judgment, she decided to check it out. As people flooded into the busy theater, Professor Bardsley stood by the door, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, or, more accurately, ghosts. There had been so many of them around town lately, whether or not he wanted to admit it at the time, so surely some of them would have come here. It was dark and difficult to see who was there, but he caught a glimpse of what he thought was Nathan Lucas, pacing up and down the aisle. He seemed to be waiting for someone, so occupied with his thoughts that he tripped over— what was that? A robot? Well, he'd seen stranger things in this town. As Mr. Lucas sat back down, Professor Bardsley pondered who it was he might have been waiting for. He knew that Lindsay's ghost had been in town. That much he remembered clearly. Perhaps he was waiting on Lindsay? Admittedly, Professor Bardsley wouldn't mind seeing Lindsay again, especially now that he had confirmed that ghosts were real, whether he liked it or not. So he made his way through the crowded theater, trying to find where Nathan had sat down. Before he could get there, however, he was stopped by a familiar face. More accurately, it was the ghost of Mr. Endicott. This time, however, he looked a little nervous. "Hello again, Professor," he said. "So, had you planted those papers in Greenhand's car after all?" "What? Oh, no, the papers were real," Professor Bardsley told him simply, his usual polite smile on his face. "I'm just glad I made it in time before they could do any damage." Mr. Endicott wandered off, apparently not comfortable continuing the conversation. Professor Bardsley nonchalantly flicked his ghostly hair out of his eyes and continued on his way toward finding Mr. Lucas. He found him sitting next to the innkeeper, Beatrix Devon, and of course, Lindsay. Professor Bardley smiled, moving toward them. Everyone already knew that both he and Lindsay had been in the chill of the night together, so surely no one would be surprised at his desire to sit next to her and catch up. And then Travis Richam appeared. The delusional man appropriately came out of the movie screen, calling out for someone named Elizabeth. Knowing Richam, he could have meant anyone, so the professor didn't pay him too much mind, leaving him to be that much more surprised when Richam floated over to where he was, practically shoving him aside so he could sit next to Lindsay, at which point he started talking about forbidden love and incest? Well then. Deciding he didn't have time to argue with Richam over the seat, Professor Bardsley instead picked a seat directly behind Lindsay. At least this way, he could quietly observe the, couple, and hopefully have some of his questions about ghosts answered. Perhaps some questions he had about the so-called Winter's Wrath as well, if they happened to know anything more about it than he did. The theater was pretty crowded, though Cassidy supposed that was to be expected when the entire town was invited. She followed the crowd, looking around to see who else was there. There were some people she knew, some she didn't, but overall... Wait a minute. Who was that talking to the veterinarian? Was that Anna Dywhite? Cassidy's head started to spin. Anna had been killed by the townspeople, and she was innocent. Even though she wasn't there when it happened, she couldn't help but feel a little responsible, especially after what had happened with Lindsay. When Lindsay died, Cassidy was so happy. Thinking back on it, it scared her. Why was she so happy about watching the townspeople kill someone, innocent or not? Would she have done the same to Anna? She wanted to believe she wouldn't, but seeing Anna there, she just felt so guilty, somehow. To make matters worse, Cassidy could hear parts of Anna's conversation with the veterinarian. She heard two names that she desperately didn't want to hear, especially not in the current context, Lindsay and Bardsley. They were here. The woman she willingly watched die, and her professor who she'd felt betrayed by. At that moment, she realized that both of them were in the same Mafia before they died. If they were both here, then... Oh, whoo, this isn't good, she muttered under her breath. Someone coughed. Hello, I'm Hermia Smith, sole reporter, editor for the Ipham Cove Weekly. I've been working on your obituaries. Professor Bardsley raised an eyebrow, realizing that the reporter was talking to him. Well, to the ghosts in general, but also him. He glanced at her as she continued her explanation, basically suggesting holding brief interviews with each of the individuals who had died in place of third-person obituaries. That's a wonderful idea, Miss Smith, Professor Bardsley replied with a smile. I would be more than happy to help you with that. And then there was another voice. It was the voice of Miss Boudreau, the same Miss Boudreau that he had killed. There were few things that truly bothered Professor Bardsley, but hearing the voices of his deceased victims was one of them. The dead were never meant to speak, he had always thought. That's why ghosts were never meant to exist. Do you have any idea how hard it's going to be to take my Webster photo now? Well, at least as far as the dead speaking went, it could have been worse. Glancing in the direction of the voice, Professor Bardsley could see that Miss Boudreau seemed to be stuck halfway through a wall. He stifled a small laugh, amused despite the circumstances. Miss Boudreau, please don't yell. It's very disruptive. Regaining his composure, he added, This isn't really the time or place to discuss such things anyway. Cassidy felt sick. First she had watched the townspeople murder that poor flower lady in cold blood, with absolutely no proof that she was Mafia. She'd begged them to stop, to at least try and find some proof before they went on with it, so there wouldn't be a repeat of Anna or any of the others, but they wouldn't listen. The poor woman's throat was slit, and she collapsed lifelessly to the cold, hard floor. And then, to make it worse, there was Professor Bardsley. He spoke in a sickeningly calm voice as he confirmed that the woman was innocent. He smiled, laughed, like he didn't care at all. Worse yet, Cassidy knew that he didn't care. In his eyes, this was all just part of some kind of twisted anthropological study. Someone was dead, and it meant nothing to him. How are you sure that she was innocent? Cassidy choked. I didn't think you knew who was in Abominable Ipham. Oh, I don't. Not yet, at least, Professor Bardsley told her. He then glanced vaguely in Piper's direction. But if she were, she would have fought back. And obviously, she didn't. Cassidy felt her head spinning as this explanation sunk in. He had a point. If that poor flower lady was really a mafioso, she likely would have gone out fighting, not apologizing to her date and giving herself up. Cassidy wanted so badly to deny it, to stand up to her former teacher and say something, but she could hardly focus. A wave of nausea overcame her as she glanced at the floor, suddenly becoming aware of just how much blood was pooling beneath the body. But she wasn't the only one upset by Bardsley's words. Professor Bardlsey was very surprised when a popcorn cart came flying toward him. He instinctively tried to duck out of the way, but it didn't matter. It simply went right through him, crashing onto the floor behind him. He blinked at this, bewildered. But that wasn't the end of the assault. "I'm tired of you!" shouted one of Miss Parker's co-workers. Mrs. Fitzgibbon, was it? "You, Morty, and your friends! You think we're all a bunch of lab rats, don't you?" She angrily marched toward him as she continued. "The sea will never take the likes of you!" Mrs. Fitzgibbon lashed at him, attempting to grab him by the collar, but just as Cassidy before, her arm passed right through him, causing her to yelp in surprise and pull back. Professor Bardlsey looked down at her with a hollow smirk, simultaneously bothered by his own lack of presence and amused that the violent assault had no effect on him at all. "Really now," he said to her as she regained her bearings, "a little heavy on the theatrics, aren't we, Mrs. And then she threw salt at him. He hadn't even thought to move this time, convinced that the salt would have as little effect as the popcorn cart had earlier, but much to his surprise, it actually hurt. Not much, granted, but enough to cause an uncomfortable stinging sensation as the salt passed through his ghostly body. He recoiled in pain, stunned by this revelation. Ghosts could be harmed by salt? Not even a special kind of salt, but ordinary table salt? A dark scowl crossed his face. Leland Graham Bardsley was not going to be bested by mere condiments. "You and your little friends have to stop this," Mrs. Fitzgibbon said, before turning away to look at Miko Shaman's lifeless body. "The whole town has to stop this." "You know it's too late for that," Professor Bardsley hissed. "This will never stop. Not until—" Bang! Cassidy shrieked, while Professor Bardsley just raised an eyebrow, looking to see where the sound had come from. He saw a woman he didn't recognize, aiming a smoking gun at the ceiling. She immediately started barking out orders. Wait, was that the sister from the church? Why wasn't she wearing her habit? "Anna, Christopher, all of you who can phase through walls, you have to help us," the sister said. "See if you can move whatever it is that is jamming the doors from outside. Everyone else, if you want to help out, first get a hold of yourselves, and second, see if you can find anything around here that we can use as a battering ram. We will get out, and we'll make Gunderson pay for all the trouble he's caused." Cassidy, though frightened and stunned by the events, nodded mutely. She attempted to regain her composure, fighting back her nausea as she hurried off to accompany the others in searching for a makeshift battering ram. Professor Bardsley, meanwhile, had no interest in helping the townspeople escape. It would be much more interesting to see how the frenzied townspeople handled it on their own, he thought to himself, as he silently drifted into the background to watch. As Cassidy was searching for something that could be used as a battering ram, she overheard the others talking about ways to break down the doors. Apparently they had been chained closed from the outside. Chained? Well, that answered the question of whether or not this was a trap, but for what purpose? For everyone to drive each other mad and start killing each other? The town was already well on their way toward that, and that was very unnerving. Anna suggested ramming into the door with her SUV, but the reporter, Cheryl Roxanne Lewis, expressed concern over a ghost's ability to drive. Cassidy fidgeted, pondering what to do in this situation. She had to do something to help. After all, she'd skipped class in order to come here, so she might as well— Wait a minute. Cassidy reached into her pocket, pulling out her cell phone and turning it back on. Immediately, she was greeted with a number of texts from her friend, Susie. "OMG, Cassidy, where are you? Please tell me you're okay. I haven't seen you all day. Cassidy, please answer your phone." Cassidy managed a small smile. Oh, Susie. That girl had no regard for the cost of texting. "Hey, my friends are still at school," Cassidy spoke up nervously. "I might be able to call someone to help." Get any friends who can either drive or know enough about cars to make one go forward at full speed. One way or another, we're getting out of here. Cassidy nodded, returning her attention to her phone. She texted a quick reply to Susie. "Trapped in the movie house. Gonna call John." She sent the message, letting out a sigh. She then pulled up her contacts list, scrolling through the list until she found her friend, Jonathan. She pressed the call button and put the phone to her ear, anxiously waiting for her friend to pick up. They should be between classes right now, so hopefully she wouldn't be interrupting anything important. Thankfully, the phone didn't ring for long. "Hello? Jonathan, listen, there's a bit of a situation here. We might need your help," she told him quickly. What? Cassidy, what's going on? I don't know for sure, Cassidy admitted, but somebody invited everyone to the movie house and chained us in. We need... What? What are you even doing at the movie house? That doesn't matter right now, Cassidy insisted. Look, we might need someone to drive into the door and break it down. I think Anna's planning on using her SUV, but if Ghost can't drive, well... Wait, what? Just get down here, okay? Bring some others maybe, she said. Tell your teacher it's an emergency if you have to. Okay, but... Meanwhile, in the back of the room, Professor Bardlsey was still watching the whole ordeal, smiling to himself in amusement. Whatever you do, you'd better make it quick, he reminded the townspeople. There's no telling when the one who put those chains there will return. Cassidy felt her throat clench. He had a point. How long had those chains been there, and how much time did they have left? Swallowing nervously, she added to her friend, Just hurry, okay? We might not have much time. What? Cassidy didn't respond, simply hanging up her phone and slipping it back into her pocket. Hopefully that would be enough to convince Jonathan of the urgency of the situation. At any rate, now all she could do was wait.